Hello and welcome to this HESES training video. In this introduction to HESES video, we'll look at why we have HESES, exactly what it represents, and then we examine its part in the OFS funding cycle. Next, we review the HESES timeline before going on to look at the key phases of the HESES process. These are completing and submitting the HESES return, and then data verification and sign-off. Finally, we'll touch on the question of multiplication factors. Why do we have HESES? Because part of the role of the OFS is to allocate funds to eligible higher education providers. We do this primarily through formula calculations. Therefore, we need suitable data, and the main source of this is the HESES survey. HESES, or to give it its full name, the Higher Education Students Early Statistics Survey, is part of the annual funding cycle that applies to all providers in the approved BCAP category of the OFS register, who must all complete the survey each year. To expand on what HESES is, it's a count of what we call years of engagement for students that are registered with higher education providers in the current academic year on courses recognised for OFS funding purposes. And throughout these presentations, it's worth remembering that the data collected is used to calculate funding allocations for eligible higher education providers. I mentioned the funding cycle earlier, so let's look at this now. Data from each HESES survey informs our grant calculations for the following academic year. So, as an example, HESES 25 data will inform funding for the 2026-27 academic year. This is shown in the top left-hand part of this diagram. Once all HESES data has been signed off, work on calculating allocations starts each year when we receive our government guidance letter, which defines the total funding available to us. This is shown at the top of this diagram. Once we have that, we start to review our funding model for the next round of allocations. The OFS board and senior management will take funding decisions on these, and our terms and conditions are published. Having finalised our funding model, that year's guide to funding is published, and then we move on to the calculation of funding allocations for the upcoming academic year. This is where our HESES data is used, although we also utilise the previous year's individualised student data from each provider via the HESES student record or via the DFE's individualised learner record, the ILR. This depends, of course, on which type of provider is being considered. Grant allocations are then announced in summer prior to the start of the academic year. Once each academic year is over, providers compile and submit their individualised data returns for submission to the DFE or HESA, and after that is complete, a new cycle is upon us with the next HESES collection. Let's outline what's needed in order to complete HESES. Providers will need the HESES workbook itself. This is available from the OFS portal from late October, and we will write to student data contacts at each provider when they are available. Providers need an understanding of their data and how this relates to the HESES definitions, which are set out in our main HESES guidance document, and we'll mention this document again soon when we review the various HESES resources available. With all this in mind, providers then need to be able to identify and count students in these categories. And this culminates in the submission of your workbook for verification, making sure that it's signed off before the final sign-off deadline. When considering the HESES timeline, note that some of the key dates vary according to the type of higher education provider involved. That is, between further education and sixth form colleges and academies, which we will refer to throughout this series of videos as FECs, and all other providers. FECs have an earlier schedule. There are historic reasons for this, but it also reflects the fact that they submit their individualised data to the DFE on a different timetable to the one used for other providers who submit to the designated data body, which is currently HESA, part of JISC. But in both cases, There are three key dates that you will need to know when completing HESES. First, the census date. Next, the submission deadline. And finally, the sign-off deadline. For FECs, the census date is the 1st of November. For all other providers, the census date is the 1st of December. The submission deadline varies according to the calendar, but valid submissions must be made by noon on the relevant date. For FECs, this is usually in mid-November. For all other providers, it's mid-December. Check our documentation for confirmation of the exact dates each year. Finally, for all providers, the sign-off deadline is right at the end of January or at the start of February, depending on how the calendar falls. After the submission deadline passes, we enter the period of data verification, which then runs through to the final sign-off deadline. Another of our videos in this series explores this process in more detail, but again, let's outline what's involved here. The data verification process helps us to ensure that we have the best possible picture of your provision, allowing us to understand the reasons and context for any changes. And it helps to pick up anomalies or errors so that our funding allocations can be as accurate as possible. Any changes to your return that may be needed can be made, and our data verification specialists will assist you to do this. For all providers, data verification must be completed by the final sign-off deadline, which is at the end of January or the start of February, depending on the calendar. Sign-off signifies that the data is accurate and fit for purpose, and that the provider's accountable officer sanctions our use of the data in our funding calculations. Finally, there is a period after the HESES sign-off deadline in which providers may make representations about the multiplication factors in their HESES workbook. We have a separate video on this topic, and it's best to defer a detailed discussion until then, but we'll cover the basics here. Multiplication factors are applied to the count of years of engagement in HESES returns to allow for the effect of the different study intensity of part-time students and of the effect of students not completing their study intentions. Doing so gives the funding FTEs that we use in our funding calculations. As we will see when we look at the workbook in more detail, multiplication factors from the previous year are carried forward into the HESES workbook. However, providers may choose to make representations for some of these to be changed, for example because they are no longer appropriate for some reason, for example because of changes in provision such as the addition, alteration or ending of courses. This is not a mandatory process, but if providers wish to make representations, they must be submitted using the HESES workbook prior to the deadline, which is usually 2 weeks after the HESES sign-off deadline. We have a number of resources for providers, and we'll look at the main ones here, but we will also highlight additional resources as we go through this series of recordings. For a high-level view of OFS funding, see our finance and funding page, www.officeforstudents.org.uk/for-providers/finance and funding, with the last two parts of that URL having the words hyphenated. For an overview of recurrent funding specifically, add the hyphenated words recurrent funding to the last URL, or perhaps an easier way is to use the search function on our main web page and enter recurrent funding. For more detail about funding, see our annual guide to funding, and you can search for that term on our website to find the latest edition. The best place to start for HESES resources is the main HESES page on the OFS website, which can be found at www.officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES, and of course that is HESES. To stay informed about OFS announcements, including those relating to funding, you can sign up for our email alert service. Visit www.officeforstudents.org.uk/sign up for email alerts, and as usual, the last part of that URL is hyphenated. Thank you for listening and watching.